Rosa Talmadge stepped off the stagecoach into the blazing October sun of 1882 with nothing but a leather trunk, a bruised heart, and a fury so deep and quiet it had taken the place of everything she used to call herself. The town of Caldwell Creek, Kansas, sprawled before her like something half-finished, as though the frontier itself had not yet decided whether to stay or blow away with the prairie wind. There was a general store with a sun-bleached sign, a saloon from which came the faint tinkling of a badly tuned piano, a livery stable with one wall leaning so severely that Rosa half expected it to apologize for itself, and a handful of houses dotting the red earth like afterthoughts. Dust moved in slow spirals along the main road, which was not much of a road at all, just packed earth and old wagon ruts hardened by the sun. She stood on the boardwalk and breathed it all in, the dry heat, the smell of horse and wood smoke and something sweetly wild she could not name, and told herself firmly that this was good. This distance from Philadelphia and its marble parlors and its careful manners was exactly what she had needed. She had needed ugly. She had needed real. She had needed somewhere so far from the world of Elliot Hargrove that his shadow could not possibly reach her. Elliot Hargrove. Even the name moved through her chest like a splinter. He had been perfect in the way only cruel men learn to be perfect. Handsome, intelligent, well-dressed, capable of saying exactly the right thing in exactly the right tone in every drawing room in the city. Rosa had loved him for 2 years with a devotion that had cost her dearly, cost her friendships and opinions, and the small pieces of herself she had quietly surrendered one by one, like coins dropped into a hat, because he always suggested so gently, with such apparent reasonableness, that those pieces of her were really not becoming. She had stopped painting, because he found her canvases embarrassing. She had stopped visiting her friend Clara, because he found Clara loud and unrefined. She had agreed to alter herself in a dozen small ways, until one morning she had looked in the mirror and not recognized the woman looking back. The night she finally understood what he was, she had overheard him at a dinner party, in a hallway he had not known she was standing in, describing her to another gentleman as useful for the family connections her father's name provided, and otherwise unremarkable. He had laughed. The other gentleman had laughed. Rosa had stood very still and felt something cold move through her, something that was grief and fury and the most devastating kind of clarity. She had ended it the following morning. He had not been surprised, only irritated, and that lack of surprise had somehow been the worst part. Her aunt, Frances Talmadge, had written letters for years from Caldwell Creek, where she ran the only bakery in town, describing the plains with a kind of breathless poetry. Rosa had read those letters before and found them quaint. Now she had written back asking if there was a room. There was always a room, Frances had replied. Come. And so here she was, 24 years old, standing in the dust of the Kansas frontier with her trunk and her damaged pride, watching a pair of cowboys ride past on horses so magnificent they made her catch her breath despite everything. She found her aunt's bakery without much trouble. It was the only building in Caldwell Creek that smelled of warm bread and cinnamon, and Frances herself met Rosa at the door before she had even reached it. A small round woman with silver-streaked hair pinned loosely above a flour-dusted apron, her eyes crinkling with such genuine warmth that Rosa felt the terrible tightening behind her eyes that meant she was very close to crying. "You look like you've been dragged across half the country," Frances said, pulling her inside. "Only about half," Rosa agreed, and Frances laughed and Rosa nearly wept, because it had been a long time since anyone had found her amusing. The room Frances gave her was small and plain, with a narrow bed covered in a patchwork quilt, a window that looked out onto the prairie and walls the color of old cream. There was a washstand, a chest of drawers, and a hook on the back of the door. That was all. Rosa set her trunk at the foot of the bed, sat down on the quilt and looked out the window at the enormous golden expanse of the Kansas plains stretching away to the edge of the sky. She breathed. She breathed again. She told herself she was going to be fine. She was not entirely sure she believed it yet, but she said it anyway. She woke the next morning before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, to the sounds of her aunt moving in the kitchen below and the smell of bread already baking. She dressed in practical clothes. She had thought to pack practical clothes, which had felt like a small act of defiance against her old life, and came downstairs to find Frances already deep in her work, kneading dough at the big central table with focused satisfaction. "Can I help?" Rosa asked. Frances looked up with genuine pleasure. "Do you know how?" "No," Rosa admitted. "Good, that means I get to teach you something." They worked side by side through the morning, Frances talking steadily about the town and its people, Rosa listening and kneading and flouring her hands, and finding that the repetitive physical labor of it, the press and fold and turn of the dough, was doing something quiet and useful to the noise inside her head. She learned that Caldwell Creek had about 300 residents, that the sheriff, a man named Beaumont, was reliable and fair, that the Dowd family ran the general store and had 4 sons and a great deal of opinion, that the saloon, the Silver Spur, was run by a woman named Marisol who was, in Frances's estimation, one of the most capable individuals west of the Mississippi, and that the largest cattle operation in the county belonged to a man named Gerald Holt, who ran several hundred head of longhorn cattle on land that stretched from Caldwell Creek south to the state line, and whose outfit employed about a dozen cowboys, the most notable of whom was his foreman. "His name is Abraham Bristol," Frances said, without particular emphasis, turning a golden loaf out of its pan. "He's been Gerald's foreman for about 4 years now. 27 years old, came up from Texas. Quiet man, works hard, fair to the horses and the men under him, which counts for a great deal out here." Rosa filed this information away alongside everything else and thought little more of it that morning. She met Abraham Bristol 3 days later, and the meeting was not romantic in the slightest. She had walked out along the northern edge of town to where the land opened up, and the sky became that improbable Kansas blue, carrying a sketchbook she had brought and not yet opened. She had told herself she was just walking, but her hand had found the sketchbook in her trunk the previous night, and she had held it for a long time, feeling the weight of the thing, remembering how Elliot had sighed when he found her painting, that particular measured sigh that managed to communicate both disappointment and generous patience. She sat on a fence rail at the edge of a pasture and opened the sketchbook to the first blank page and sat there with her pencil not moving. Behind her, a horse nickered. She turned startled to find a rider pulling up along the fence line, a man on a dark brown horse, wearing a broad-brimmed hat pushed back enough that she could see his face, which was angular and weathered, and presently wearing an expression of mild surprise at finding a woman sitting on his employer's fence rail. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," Rosa said, because whatever else Elliot Hargrove had done to her, he had not touched her manners. The man looked at her for a moment with calm brown eyes. "That's Holt's fence you're sitting on, ma'am. Not that he'd mind, but I thought you should know whose it is." "I apologize," Rosa said, climbing off the rail with more dignity than the action probably warranted. "I'll move." "You don't have to move," he said. "I just like people to know the lay of the land. I'm Abraham Bristol. I work for Gerald Holt." "I know who you are," Rosa said, which came out sounding more pointed than she intended. "My aunt mentioned you, Frances Talmadge from the bakery." Something shifted in his expression, not a smile exactly, but the territory adjacent to one. "Miss Frances is a fine woman, best sourdough in the county. She would be very pleased to hear you say that." He tilted his head slightly, looking at the sketchbook she was holding against her side. "Were you drawing?" "I was attempting to," she said. He did not press the point, which she appreciated. He touched the brim of his hat, which she had already noticed was a practiced gesture with him, and turned his horse back toward the herd he had presumably ridden away from. She watched him go and realized that the entire exchange had been perhaps the most straightforward conversation she had experienced in 2 years. No undercurrents. No careful calibration of what she ought to say or whether she had said it correctly. Just 2 people speaking plainly to each other in the morning sun, with the cattle moving slowly in the background. She opened her sketchbook and drew the fence. Then she drew the cattle. Then, almost without intending to, she drew the rough outline of a man on horseback, half turned away, moving toward the horizon. She looked at it for a long time, then turned the page and told herself it was merely practice. October burned toward November in Caldwell Creek, the days growing shorter and the plains wind developing an edge. Rosa settled into the rhythm of the town with an ease that surprised her. She helped Francis in the bakery mornings, found herself oddly devoted to the craft of bread making, the transformation of simple ingredients into something warm and nourishing. She bought canvas and oil paints from the Dow General Store. They had only a small selection, clearly ordered for the schoolteacher who used them, but Rosa was grateful for every tube and began painting in the afternoons. She painted the landscape. She painted the sky, which was endlessly different and endlessly astonishing, lavender at dawn and burning gold at midday and a deep bruised purple at dusk. She painted the way light moved across the plain grass. She painted Francis's hands, flowery and capable. She painted horses. She did not paint people at first, because painting people felt intimate, felt like a declaration of attention, and she was not ready to be that attentive to anyone. She also met Marisol Vargas, who ran the Silver Spur, and found Francis's assessment entirely accurate. Marisol was perhaps 35, with dark hair and sharp eyes, and the manner of someone who had navigated a great deal of difficult territory and come out knowing exactly what she was worth. She allowed Rosa to sit in a corner of the saloon on Wednesday afternoons when it was quiet, because the light through the west-facing windows at that hour was extraordinary, and Rosa had mentioned it and Marisol had said simply, "Then come on Wednesdays." It was in the Silver Spur one Wednesday that Rosa encountered Abraham Bristol again, this time not on horseback in a pasture but sitting at a corner table with a cup of coffee, studying something that turned out to be a livestock ledger. He looked up when she came in and nodded with the same unhurried recognition as before. Marisol was behind the bar polishing glasses. "You two know each other." "We've met," Rosa said. "Briefly," Abraham said. "Well, now you can meet properly," Marisol said, with the brisk practicality of someone who had organized enough introductions to know that people often needed a little pushing. Rosa set up her small traveling easel by the west window and Abraham returned to his ledger, and they existed in companionable quiet for perhaps 20 minutes before Abraham said, without looking up from his figures, "What are you painting?" "The light," Rosa said. He looked up then, across the room at her canvas, which showed the interior of the saloon flooded with afternoon gold, the bar shining and the dust motes suspended in the air like small planets. He looked at it with genuine consideration, not the polite and rapidly concluded attention that most people gave to paintings. "That's something," he said finally. She felt a warmth move through her that she immediately regarded with great suspicion. "Thank you," she said and looked at her canvas. "Where are you from?" he asked. "Philadelphia. Long way." "Yes." "What brought you out here?" She considered the question, which was direct enough to deserve a direct answer but not so intrusive as to require more than she wanted to give. "I needed to be somewhere different." He nodded as if this were a perfectly sufficient explanation, which, she found, it was. He returned to his ledger. She returned to her painting. Outside, the wind moved through the grasses and the light shifted slowly in the window. After a while she said, "Where are you from?" "Texas originally, town called Laredo." "Is there family there?" "Not anymore." He said it without self-pity, which told her it was old grief, the kind that had been worn smooth by time. "My mother passed when I was 17, my father before that. I came north, worked my way up through Texas outfits, ended up here." "And you like it, Caldwell Creek?" He seemed to think about it honestly rather than giving the reflexive yes that politeness would have dictated. "It's good land," he said. "Gerald Holt is a fair man. The work suits me." He paused. "There's a lot of sky." "There is," Rosa agreed, looking out the window. "I keep trying to paint it and I don't think I ever get it right." "Maybe the right isn't the point," he said. She looked at him. He was looking back at his ledger, apparently unaware that he had just said something that landed directly in the center of her. She looked back at her canvas and thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. Over the following weeks, something quiet and careful began to develop between them. It was not pursued aggressively by either party. It was more like watching a creek find its level, something gradual and determined by the natural shape of the land. They encountered each other regularly, which in a town of 300 was not surprising, but which began to feel, to Rosa at least, like something other than coincidence. Abraham would stop by the bakery in the mornings on his way to Holt's land for supplies or messages, and Frances, who was not as oblivious as she chose to appear, would very often find a reason to be in the back when he arrived so that Rosa was the one who handed him his order across the counter. They talked about small things at first, but the small things accumulated. She learned that he had taught himself to read from a Bible and a copy of a Shakespeare play he had found in a bunkhouse, which was such an unexpected detail that she had laughed out loud, and then covered her mouth because the laughter had surprised her. It had come from somewhere genuine and unlocked inside her, somewhere she had almost forgotten existed. He learned that she had studied briefly at a women's college in Massachusetts before her father's death had brought her back to Philadelphia, and a life that had gradually contracted around her like a corset pulled too tight. He did not ask about Elliot. She was grateful for this. She was not ready to speak about Elliot, which had nothing to do with any remaining tenderness, and everything to do with the fact that speaking about it would require her to examine the full shape of what she had allowed to happen to herself, and she was still in the process of arriving at that examination. November brought its first frost, and the town shifted its rhythms accordingly. The cattle drives of the season wound down, and the cowboys who had been moving herds north through Caldwell Creek thinned out, and the men who remained belonged to winter in a particular way, more settled, less transient. Abraham's work changed with the season too, moving from the hard miles of open range to the steadier work of maintaining equipment, fences, and winter feed, work that brought him into town more often. There was a community dinner at the church in the third week of November, a celebration of the harvest and a gathering of the 300 souls of Caldwell Creek who had made it through another year of frontier life. Frances brought an enormous braided bread that drew immediate and deserved admiration. Rosa brought a pie she had made herself from preserved peaches, a thing she was quietly proud of. Abraham came in from the cold with 2 other cowboys from the Holt outfit, men named Carver and Dix, good-natured and rough-mannered in a way that was entirely without malice, and when he spotted Rosa across the room he walked toward her with the particular directness that she had come to recognize as characteristic of him. No performance, no calculation, just a man going where he intended to go. "That your pie?" he asked, nodding at it on the table. "It is. I'll be having a slice." It was, she recognized, a rather wonderful way of saying he thought well of her. "You haven't tried it yet," she said. "I don't need to," he said. She could feel the warmth in her face and had no idea what to do with it. He had a slice. He had a second slice. He stood beside her for most of the evening, and they talked about the town and the winter coming and whether the Dowd brothers were really as quarrelsome as Frances said they were. And at no point during the evening did Rosa feel the need to calibrate her opinions or moderate her humor or check herself against some imagined standard of what was becoming. She drove home in Frances's wagon that night under a sky so thick with stars it seemed audacious, and Frances drove and said nothing, which was its own kind of commentary. "He's a good man," Frances said finally when they were almost home. "I'm aware," Rosa said. "Are you?" Rosa looked at the stars. "I'm not ready," she said, and meant it. "Nobody ever is," Frances said comfortably, and that was all. What changed things, what accelerated the careful pace of things, was not anything dramatic but something small and specifically painful. A letter arrived from Philadelphia in late November. It was not from Elliot directly. It was from her friend Clara, the one Elliot had persuaded her to stop seeing, who had apparently decided that distance and time were sufficient reason to reopen communication. Clara wrote warmly and at length, full of news about Philadelphia, and at the end of the letter, in a paragraph clearly intended to be passed along neutrally but which landed like a stone thrown hard, she mentioned that Elliot Hargrove had become engaged to a Miss Vanessa Aldwick, whose family owned half a shipping concern, and the engagement had been announced in 3 newspapers and the talk of every parlor. Rosa sat with the letter at the kitchen table for a very long time. She was careful to establish with herself, devastated in the way she would have been a year ago. She did not want him back. She was quite certain of that. But the information opened something in her chest that she would not have predicted, not grief exactly, but something like shame, the shame of having been so thoroughly known by someone who thought so little of her, the shame of having volunteered herself for it, having shaped herself around a man who had already decided precisely what she was worth and found the number unimpressive. Francis came in, saw the letter, saw Rosa's face, and put the kettle on. "Do you want to talk about it?" Rosa told her then. Not everything, not every small capitulation, every gradual erosion, but enough. The 2 years. The way he had admired her first and then begun adjusting her, and how she had let him, had believed that the adjustments were improvements. The night of the dinner party and what she had heard in the hallway, leaving, coming west. Francis listened throughout without interrupting, which was a gift. "He's engaged," Rosa said, "to someone with a shipping fortune." "Well," Francis said, "that tells you everything about what he was after." "I know that," Rosa said. "I've known it." But knowing it and feeling it entirely are different things. "Yes," Francis agreed. "They are." Rosa folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket. She picked up her tea. She sat for a while longer in the kitchen with the smell of bread around her and the frost pressing at the window, and she thought about the person she had been before Elliot Hargrove, and the person she had been during him, and the person she was now, sitting in a bakery kitchen in Kansas, making pie from scratch and painting sky, and still somewhat in the process of remembering who she was. She went out walking that afternoon, which she often did, but this time she walked further than usual, out past the edges of town and into the open land, where the winter grass was pale gold and the wind was cold and clean. She walked without purpose, which was what she needed, and when she had walked far enough that the town was small behind her, she stopped and stood in the middle of all that space and felt very small herself and found it oddly comforting. She heard a horse. She turned. Abraham was riding along the fence line of the south pasture which bordered the land she had wandered onto, and when he saw her he slowed and then stopped. "You walked a ways," he said. "I needed to," she said. He looked at her face. He said nothing for a moment, but the quality of his looking was attentive in a way that was not intrusive, the way a careful person looks when they want to understand something rather than simply react to it. "You want company?" he asked. It was, she realized, the right question, not assuming she did, not assuming she didn't. "Yes," she said. "Actually, yes." He dismounted, looped his horse's reins over the fence post, and came through the gate, and they walked together across the pale grass for a while without speaking. The sun was low, and the shadows were long, and the sky was doing something magnificent with pink and orange that she filed away for later. "I got a letter from home," she said eventually. "Bad news." "Not exactly." She considered how much to say. "A man I knew in Philadelphia has become engaged. It's not that I don't want him, that's quite clear to me, but it's made me think about things." "What kind of things?" She stopped walking and looked at the horizon. "I was someone before I met him," she said. "Someone with opinions and paintings and particular habits of thought, and I allowed him to diminish those things, one by one. Because I believed he knew better than I did what I ought to be. And when I finally left him, I thought I had recovered myself. But standing here, I realize that I am still in the process of recovery. I'm not yet entirely sure who I am." She had not intended to say so much, but it had come out in the cold prairie air, and now it was there. Abraham was quiet for a moment. He bent and picked up a piece of dried grass and turned it between his fingers. "I think the fact that you can name that is worth something," he said. "Maybe." "I'm serious," he said. A lot of people never get to the naming of it. They just carry the shape of somebody else's opinion of them and call it their character. He paused. Who were you before him? She looked at him. Someone who painted, someone who had opinions about books and argued about them, someone who found herself funny occasionally. She stopped. Someone who made people laugh. I used to make people laugh. I had forgotten that. He looked at her steadily. You've made me laugh twice now, have I? When you said you knew who I was before I introduced myself, and when you told me about the Shakespeare in the bunkhouse. She had not realized she'd made him laugh. She had thought he was merely being polite. I hadn't noticed, she said. You weren't paying attention to the right things, he said gently. She stood in the winter grass and felt something shift, something deep and structural, the way a foundation settles after a long time under weight. It was not a dramatic shift. It was quiet and slow, but it was real. I think that might be the kindest thing anyone has said to me in quite some time, she said. He nodded, as if this were information he would hold carefully and not misuse. They walked back toward town together as the sun finished going down, and the horse followed along the fence at a patient walk as if accustomed to waiting, and the stars began coming out overhead one by one like slow declarations. December came to Caldwell Creek with real cold, and the town pulled together in the way frontier towns do in winter, because the cold is a democracy. It does not care about social distinctions. Everyone is cold together, and there is a kind of fellowship in that. Rosa had fallen into the town with a thoroughness that still surprised her. She knew people now: Marisol, Sheriff Beaumont, the widow Harper who lived 3 houses from the bakery, and had opinions about everything, and was almost never wrong, old Doc Briggs who had been in Caldwell Creek since before it was a town, and treated everyone from broken bones to heartache with equal brisk competence. She knew the Dowd family, all 4 brothers, and the complicated ecosystem of their relationships with one another. She knew the schoolteacher, a solemn young man named Percy Alderton, who was doing excellent work with 40 children in a building designed for 20. She had also begun teaching a small painting class on Saturday mornings, which had started with 2 women, the schoolteacher's wife and a rancher's daughter named June, and grown to 7 by the middle of December. She had not set out to teach. June had seen her painting in the street one afternoon and said, with the directness of the frontier, "I've always wanted to do that. Will you teach me?" And Rosa had said yes before she fully considered it and discovered that she loved it, the passing on of the seeing, which was what painting really was, learning to look at something until you understood how the light fell on it. It had been Eliot's sigh that had taken that away from her. That measured, tolerant sigh, which had communicated so efficiently that this thing she loved was an embarrassment. But here she was, teaching. Here she was, painting every afternoon. Here she was, recognizing herself in the act of it. She mentioned this to Abraham one evening. She had taken to walking past the livery stable in the late afternoons when she knew he would often be there at the end of his workday, tending to his horse before heading to the bunkhouse at Holt's property. The horse was a dark bay named Solomon, who had taken an immediate and inexplicable liking to Rosa, pressing his large nose against her shoulder every time she came near, which she found flattering despite herself. "I think I am beginning to remember myself," she told Abraham, feeding Solomon a piece of carrot she had brought. She had started bringing carrot pieces deliberately, which she did not fully examine. Abraham was rubbing the horse down with a cloth. He looked sideways at her. "Tell me what that means." "I painted something today that I'm proud of," she said. "Not just competent, proud. The way I used to feel before I stopped letting myself feel it." And one of my students, June, she managed a particular thing with the light on water, and the expression on her face it was the expression of someone who has just understood something beautiful. And I thought I put that there. I made the conditions for that to happen. She paused. I used to do that, not painting but making things, making people feel that things were possible. I had forgotten I could do it. He set down the cloth and leaned on the stall door and looked at her. "You've been doing it since you got here," he said. "I don't know if you realize." "What do you mean?" "Francis is different, lighter." She tells me things about her week now when I come by, which she didn't used to do. And Marisol, she's got your paintings on the wall of the saloon now, which she'd tell anyone was good for business, but we both know it's because she likes them. And Percy Alderton's wife has been coming to your class, and Percy told me 2 weeks ago that he hasn't seen her this pleased with herself in years. He paused. You've been doing it. Rosa stood very still in the smell of hay and horse and winter cold coming through the open livery doors. You've been paying attention, she said, which was not exactly what she meant to say, but was the thing that was most affecting her in that moment. I generally do, he said, with a quietness that was not quite modest and not quite confident, just honest. She looked at him in the dim light of the livery, at the angled jaw and the careful brown eyes and the quality of his attention, which had always made her feel seen rather than examined. And she understood that she had been walking toward this moment for weeks, and that the walking had been the point, because she had needed the walking. She had needed the time and the distance and the cold Kansas air and the bread and the painting and the slow, patient work of remembering herself. She had needed to be Rosa Talmadge again before she could possibly let anyone else know her. Abraham, she said. Yes. I think she started again. I'm not very practiced at saying what I mean directly. I was trained out of it. I know, he said. I'm going to practice it now. All right. I think you are the most genuine person I have met in a very long time, she said, and I find myself looking forward to seeing you in a way that I would describe as significant. He was quiet for a moment. Solomon shifted in the stall behind him. I find myself looking forward to seeing you in a way I would also describe as significant, he said. Have for a while. Have you? Since the fence rail, he admitted. She laughed. It came out warm and clear in the cold air, and Solomon startled slightly, and Abraham smiled. And it was the first time she had seen him smile fully, with both sides of his face committed to it, and it did something very serious to her composure. The fence rail, she repeated. I was just sitting on a fence rail. You were sitting on the fence rail with a sketchbook you weren't opening, he said, and you looked like someone who was fighting very hard to be brave. And I thought, whoever that is, they are worth knowing. She reached up and straightened a strap on Solomon's halter that did not need straightening, because she needed something to do with her hands. That was fairly perceptive of you, she said. It was pretty clear, he said. She walked home in the dark along the main road with the stars above her and her hands warm from Solomon's muzzle, and something in her chest that was light and bright, and a little frightening in the way all true things are frightening. Christmas in Caldwell Creek was modest and warm. The church was decorated with pine boughs that someone had brought from the hill country 60 miles west, and the community gathered on Christmas Eve for carols and the exchanging of small gifts. Rosa had made gifts for Francis, for Marisol, for Mrs. Alderton and June, small painted cards with scenes of the town, the kind of thing she could produce quickly but with genuine care. She had also spent 3 evenings on something else, something she had not told anyone about. It was a painting, small, meant to fit in the inside pocket of a jacket, painted on a piece of treated board she had acquired from Doc Briggs's supply of materials. It was Solomon, the dark bay horse, in the south pasture in the particular afternoon light she had memorized over weeks of passing it. She had tried to get the quality of his alertness, the way he stood not waiting but simply being, entirely himself. She thought she had managed it. She found Abraham at the church on Christmas Eve and handed it to him without preamble, because she had decided that practicing directness was important. He looked at it for a long time. That's Solomon, he said. Yes. This is Rosa, this is remarkable. The use of her first name without any preceding permission was such a natural thing, such an unforced arrival, that she felt it in the same way she felt warm bread something basic and necessary and deeply right. I wanted to make you something, she said, and I've been watching Solomon long enough that I thought I could get him right. He looked at the painting and then looked at her and said, You did get him right. He held it with the care one gives to things of real value. He had brought her something too. He produced it from his coat pocket, a piece of ribbon of deep red, the kind sold at the general store, wrapped around a small pressed flower he had apparently preserved from the summer's growth, a wildflower from the prairie. "I know it's simple," he said. "It's not simple," she said. "It's specific." She held the pressed flower carefully. "Someone had to notice a flower worth keeping." "I did," he said. She looked up at him in the candlelight of the church, and she thought, here is a man who notices things. Here is a man who kept a summer flower because he thought it might matter to someone in winter. Here is a man who counts the ways other people have brightened and pays attention to their work and stands steady in the cold without making a performance of it. She thought, I am not afraid of this. She thought, that is new. After the service, in the cold outside the church with their breath making small clouds, he asked if he could walk her home. She said yes. They walked slowly through the town, which was settled and quiet and starlit, and he talked about Christmas when he was a boy in Texas, his mother making tamales and his father actually managing to be present and sober on that one day of the year. And she talked about Christmas in Philadelphia, the big house on Chestnut Street, her father alive and her mother alive and herself young enough to believe that the world was as elegant and reliable as the Christmas table looked. "Do you miss Philadelphia?" he asked. "I miss the people I was wrong about," she said. "I miss the version of it that I believed in, not the reality," she considered. "I don't miss it the way I expected to. I expected to miss it terribly and want to go back, but I don't want to go back. I'm not sure I even want to go back and visit." "What do you want?" he asked. It was a direct question but not an aggressive one, the kind of question that came from genuine curiosity rather than any desire to corner her. She thought about it honestly. "I want to paint," she said. "I want to keep teaching. I want to keep making bread and finding out what else I'm capable of that I haven't discovered yet." She paused. "And I want to be in a place where people see me clearly." "People see you clearly here," he said. "I'm beginning to think so," she said. They had reached the bakery. The windows were dark, Frances having gone to bed with the early hours kept by bakers. They stood on the step in the cold. "I'd like to call on you properly," Abraham said. "If you'd allow it." She looked at him. In the moonlight he was solid and real, the kind of person who occupied the world without apology but also without excess, and she thought, yes, this is someone to know. This is someone worth the considerable vulnerability of being known. "Yes," she said, "I would allow it." He touched the brim of his hat, which she had now learned meant something ranging from acknowledgement to affection, and walked back into the night. She stood on the step for a moment longer, just breathing, and realized she was smiling in the dark, which was the kind of thing you can do when no one is watching, and which, she thought, was perhaps one of the best things in the world. January arrived harsh and direct. A blizzard came through in the second week, the kind that put 2 feet of snow on the ground in 18 hours and brought the town to a complete stop for 3 days. The cattle had to be brought in close. Every available hand at the Holt operation was out in the weather working, and Rosa heard from Frances, who had heard from the widow Harper, who had heard from Sheriff Beaumont, that 2 of the young cowboys had been lost briefly in the whiteout conditions before Abraham went back for them and brought them in. When she saw him 2 days after the storm, when the roads were clear enough that he had come into town for supplies, she looked at his face for a moment longer than usual, cataloging the cold-reddened cheeks and the tiredness around the eyes, and felt something fierce and protective and entirely new to her, the specific anxiety of caring about someone who works in danger as a matter of course. "I heard you went back into the blizzard," she said. "Carver and Dix are young," he said. "They got turned around." "That was dangerous." "Yes," he agreed simply, as if danger were a fact of the landscape like the fence posts or the sky, present and navigable rather than something to be dramatized. She put her hand on his forearm over his coat, just briefly, just a moment of contact. He looked down at her hand and then up at her face, and what moved across his expression was something so careful and so warm that she felt it in her whole chest. "I'm glad you're all right," she said. "So am I," he said, which was such an understated thing that she almost laughed and didn't, because this was one of those moments that deserved not to be broken. He began calling on her formally in January, which in Caldwell Creek meant that he came to the bakery on Saturday evenings after supper, and Frances would sit with her knitting in the corner of the parlor for the first portion of the visit, and then very considerately develop a need to check something in the kitchen and remain there for a remarkably long time. They talked. They talked about everything, and Rosa discovered that two people talking honestly about things, about the world they lived in, and the things they believed and the lives they had had before this place, was a form of intimacy she had undervalued. With Elliot, conversation had always had a slightly competitive quality, a sense of points being scored or positions being defended. With Abraham, conversation was simply the process of knowing each other better, and she found it endlessly interesting. He told her about the injustice of the range wars he had witnessed coming up through Texas, the way large cattle interests had pushed out small ranchers and homesteaders, the way the law was frequently on the side of whoever had the most money, which was not always the same as whoever was right. He talked about it with a clear-eyed anger that was not helpless, the anger of someone who understood a wrong and named it accurately, and lived with integrity within the constraints of what he could change. He talked about the Comanche and Kiowa peoples he had encountered in his travels through Texas, the profound injustices of the removal policies and the broken treaties, the way the government spoke of civilization while conducting systematic destruction. He talked about this without the comfortable dismissal she had heard from most men of her acquaintance. He had known people. He had seen things. He spoke with the weight of that. She admired him for it and told him so. "It doesn't cost much to see clearly," he said. "The cost comes if you refuse to. More people refuse to than you might think," she said. "No," he said. "I know exactly how many people refuse to. It's a lot." She told him about the things she had observed too, about the women in Philadelphia who were brilliant and ambitious and had nowhere to put it, about the way the entire social structure of her world had been organized to make women grateful for the smallest recognitions while systematically excluding them from the larger ones. She told him about the college she had attended briefly, about the professors who had been visibly irritated by female students who were better than their male counterparts and had exercised that irritation in small punishing ways. He listened to all of it. "What do you want for yourself?" he asked one evening in late January, the fire going well and the snow pressing at the windows. "Not what's available or what's practical. What do you actually want?" She thought about it seriously, the way he asked for things seriously, the way that deserved a real answer. "I want my painting to mean something," she said. "I want to be useful to people in ways that are genuine, not decorative. I want to stop feeling like I am taking up space apologetically." She paused. "I want to teach, I think, not just the painting class but more broadly. There's a need here. Percy Alderton is doing excellent work, but he's one person and there are 40 children. I've been thinking about whether there's a way to help." "Have you talked to Percy?" "Not yet." "He would welcome it," Abraham said. "I know he would." She spoke to Percy the following week, and by the 1st of February, she was spending 2 mornings a week at the schoolhouse, teaching the older children reading and composition while Percy focused on arithmetic and the younger students. She recognized with a clarity that was almost physical, becoming someone. Not recovering the old Rosa Talmadge or constructing a new one from nothing, but growing into whoever she had always been capable of being if the space had been made available to her. The space here was vast. It was, in fact, the entire Kansas sky. February brought a stretch of clear, cold days, bright blue and sharp, and Rosa and Abraham began taking rides together on Sunday afternoons when his work allowed. She had learned to ride as a girl and had not forgotten, which pleased him, and he was teaching her the particular equestrian knowledge of the frontier, how to read a horse's mood, how to know whether ground ahead was trustworthy, how to handle an unexpected situation without panicking the animal. She was a quick study. He told her so, and she absorbed the compliment without deflecting it, which was itself a new thing. They rode out across the plains in the cold, clear light, and she brought her sketchbook, and he would occasionally stop, and she would draw the landscape while he sat on his horse with the easy patience of a man who has learned that waiting is not wasted time. "You make being still look effortless," she told him one afternoon, watching him on horseback against the winter sky, and pulled out her sketchbook. "Are you drawing me?" he asked. "I was going to. May I?" He was quiet for a moment. "Nobody's ever drawn me before," he said. "Is that a yes?" "Yes," he said. She drew him. She had not attempted to paint people since arriving in Caldwell Creek, because people felt too intimate, but she had said earlier to herself that she was recovering her courage, and she held herself to it now. She drew him as he sat, the line of his shoulders, the set of his jaw, the particular quality of his stillness, which was not passive at all but alert, an attention turned outward at the world. She showed him when she had finished. He looked at it for a longer time than he had looked at anything, and when he handed it back his expression had something in it she had not seen before, something young and a little undone. "That's how you see me," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her, and the winter light was between them, and she thought, "This is the moment." Not the moment of declaration that would come, but the moment before the moment when you understand that what is between you is real and cannot be misread. He reached across from his horse and took her gloved hand in his. They rode back toward town in the long winter shadows, her hand warm in his, Solomon walking steadily beside her borrowed mare. In March, the weather broke and the world came back in a rush. The prairies greened almost overnight, which Rosa had not anticipated and which entirely overwhelmed her. She had not understood until she saw the Kansas spring arrive that green could look like that, could be that forceful and specific, a green that looked intentional, as if the earth had made a decision. She painted almost constantly that March. She had begun working on a larger canvas, the largest she had attempted, a panoramic view of the plains in spring light that she intended as both a record and a declaration. "Look at what this place is. Look at what I found here." Abraham came by the bakery on a Tuesday evening in the second week of March, looking more purposeful than usual, with his hat in his hands, which she had learned meant something was significant to him. Francis took one look at him and found something to do in the kitchen. He sat down across from Rosa at the parlor table and said, without preamble, because he was not a man who approached things obliquely, "I need to say something." "All right," she said. "I have been thinking about this since January," he said, "and I want to be sure I say it right, so I am going to ask you to be patient with me because I'm not a man who talks fancy." "I do not require fancy," she said. He looked at her steadily. "You came here wounded," he said. "I could see it from the start, and I didn't want to be a man who added to that, so I've been careful, but I need you to know that every day I see you, you're more yourself, and every version of yourself I see is someone I admire profoundly." He stopped. "I'm in love with you, Rosa." She sat very still. "I don't say that lightly," he continued, "and I'm not asking anything of you tonight except that you know it. Because you deserve to be told by someone who means it." She looked at him, at the earnest and steady quality of his face, at the hat turning in his hands, at the man who had walked back into a blizzard for two young cowboys and kept a summer flower for winter and paid attention to Solomon, and said you weren't paying attention to the right things when she hadn't realized she'd made him laugh. "Abraham," she said. "Yes. I am in love with you too," she said. "I have been for some time, and I have been examining it very carefully to make sure I was not confusing gratitude or relief or the novelty of being treated well with something deeper. And it is deeper," she said, "considerably." He exhaled a long, steady breath and smiled and reached across the table and took both of her hands in his. "All right then," he said. "All right," she agreed. Francis appeared in the kitchen doorway at that moment with 2 cups of tea and an expression of complete innocence that fooled no one. "I made tea," she announced. "You were listening," Rosa said. "The parlor wall is thin," Francis said serenely, and set the tea down and went back to the kitchen. They were married in June of 1883, on a day of such perfect weather that Rosa would later describe it as the sky cooperating, blue from edge to edge and warm and the wind soft. The whole town came. This was not surprising in a town of 300, where an event of any significance drew everyone, but there was something in the gathering that felt to Rosa like a genuine expression of communal warmth, rather than the performance of it that she had seen at Philadelphia society events. Marisol brought flowers from the kitchen garden she kept behind the silver spur, big armloads of summer blooms in yellow and orange and white. Frances made the wedding cake, a 3-layer construction of honey and almond that was consumed down to the last crumb. Percy Alderton's wife played the piano for the ceremony. Sheriff Beaumont stood up with Abraham as his witness, because Abraham's friendship with the sheriff was one of those quiet, uncelebrated bonds of mutual respect that the frontier produced regularly. And Frances stood with Rosa, who had no sisters but found that Frances had become something adjacent to one. Rosa wore a dress the color of cream, made by the widow Harper, who turned out to have been a fine seamstress in her earlier life, with small blue flowers embroidered at the collar that Rosa had designed herself. She carried the wildflower, not the original pressed one, which she had framed, but fresh ones from the same field, pale purple and yellow, gathered the morning of the wedding. She walked to Abraham at the front of the church and looked at him and thought, "Here is someone who knew me when I was in the process of becoming myself again and loved me in the becoming." She thought, "Here is someone who sees clearly and tells the truth and goes back into the blizzard." She thought, "I know exactly what I am doing." When the minister asked and she said, "I do," she said it with the full weight of herself behind it, every piece of herself that she had recovered and every piece she was still discovering. Abraham said, his "I do" looking at her face with an expression so entirely unguarded that she felt it like sunlight. They had a small house on the western edge of Caldwell Creek, purchased with what Rosa had brought from Philadelphia and supplemented by Abraham's savings, which were considerable for a man of his position and spoke to years of careful purpose. The house was simple, 3 rooms downstairs and 2 up, a covered porch that looked west over the plain, a kitchen garden that Rosa immediately began to organize with more ambition than experience, a barn for Solomon and her mare, who had been a wedding gift from Gerald Holt and who Rosa had named Compass. The first weeks of their marriage were ones that Rosa would return to in memory throughout her life as a kind of gold standard. Not because they were perfect. They were 2 real people establishing the particular ecology of a shared life, and that process involved plenty of negotiation and the occasional flare of friction. But because they were genuine, in the way that things are genuine when both people involved have decided to stop performing and simply be. She learned things about him she had not known. He woke very early, before even the winter dark had fully lifted, a habit from years of ranch work that he could not seem to alter. He made terrible coffee, which she pointed out with what she considered enormous tact, and he received with good humor. He had a particular relationship with his silences that she had already partially understood. They were not cold silences or withholding silences, but a kind of active quiet, a processing, and she learned to read them. He whistled when he was content without being aware of it, and the sound of it from somewhere on the property became one of her favorite things. He learned things about her too. She was not a morning person, which was a significant incompatibility given his early hours, but which they resolved by him being very quiet and leaving coffee for her regardless of its quality. She had strong opinions about color that she expressed with a fervor he found amusing and never mocked. She laughed at her own jokes before the punchline, which she couldn't help, and which he found endearing in the specific way you find someone's small imperfections endearing when you love them. She did not always talk about what was bothering her immediately but needed to walk first, and he learned that if she suddenly needed to walk, the right thing was to simply ask if she wanted company. The painting class had grown, by the autumn of 1883, to 15 regular students, which was more than Rosa had a room for in any single space. Marisol offered the Silver Spur on weekday mornings before it opened for business, and the strange combination of a saloon as an art studio seemed to work perfectly. The long tables cleared, and the light coming through those west windows that Rosa had always found ideal. She was also still teaching at the schoolhouse 2 mornings a week, and Percy Alderton had begun suggesting, with increasing directness, that what Caldwell Creek actually needed was a proper school with 2 teachers, which would require approaching the county for funds, but which Percy believed was achievable. Rosa began composing a letter to the county authorities that she and Percy worked on together through the fall. Abraham, watching her move through all of this with the focused energy of someone who has found their purpose and is putting their full weight behind it, told her one evening that she was building something. "We're building something," she corrected. "Yes," he agreed. "We are." He had been given, by Gerald Holt, a small piece of land adjacent to the Holt property, a bonus from a cattle season that had gone particularly well, and he and Rosa had begun talking about what to do with it. There was water on the property, a small creek, and the grass was good. "We could run our own cattle," he said, slowly, "build it up alongside my work for Holt. Is that what you want?" He looked at the land, which they were standing on in the October wind, his land, their land. "I want to build something with my own hands that means something," he said. "Something that will last." She understood that perfectly. They started with 20 head of cattle in the spring of 1884, purchased through careful negotiation and Abraham's relationships in the ranching community. It was not a large operation by any measure, but it was theirs, and they worked it together on weekends and in the margins of their other work, and it grew steadily with the methodical patience that Abraham applied to everything. And then, in the spring of 1884, Rosa discovered she was pregnant. She told Abraham on a Tuesday morning. He had been about to leave for Holt's land, and she had come out onto the porch and called him back and told him standing there in the spring morning. He stood very still for a moment, and she watched the information move through him, watched the recognition of it, and then the weight of it, and then something very like wonder. "A baby," he said. "Yes." He crossed the porch in 2 steps and held her carefully, both arms, his hat falling somewhere off his head, and she could feel his heartbeat against her cheek, faster than usual. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Are you well?" "I'm quite well," she said. "A little unsteady some mornings, but Doc Briggs says that's normal." He pulled back enough to look at her face, and his expression was such a complicated mixture of joy and seriousness and tenderness that she had to reach up and put her hand on his face to organize herself. "We are going to be excellent at this," she said, which was an assertion of faith rather than a certainty, and he received it as such. "We are going to try very hard," he said, which was more honest and exactly right. Frances was beside herself with happiness at the news. Marisol offered congratulations with characteristic efficiency, and then went and reorganized the Saturday painting class schedule to accommodate Rosa's rest requirements, without being asked. The widow Harper, who had seen everything and forgot nothing, said that the child would be lucky, because clever parents were the best gift. Rosa's pregnancy was not uneventful in the ways she had perhaps romanticized it might be. She was tired in a way that was foundational, not sleepiness but something deeper, and the paintings she managed during those months were smaller and closer to home. The kitchen table, the garden coming up, Solomon through the barn window. But she managed them. She kept painting and she kept teaching because those things were not optional aspects of her life but essential ones, and Doc Briggs, who was a practical man, said that useful work done at a sensible pace was good for everyone. Abraham was attentive without being smothering, a distinction she appreciated more than she could fully articulate. He was present. He took on more of the household work without announcement or requirement of gratitude. He rode home from Holt's land faster in the evenings. He read to her some nights, from one of the novels they had ordered from a bookseller in Wichita, sitting by the lamp with the book open, and his voice doing something pleasant to the words. She asked him once if he was frightened. Yes, he said immediately, which was exactly what she had hoped he would say. What frightens you? He thought about it. That I won't be equal to it, he said, that I won't know enough. My father, he stopped. He wasn't a good father, he didn't know how to be present, and I don't want to replicate that. You won't, she said. You can't know that, he said. I know you, she said. You go back into the blizzard, you watch for people who are struggling. You kept a flower in your pocket because you thought it might matter to someone in winter. She looked at him. You will be an extraordinary father. He looked at his hands for a moment. I will try to be, he said. That's all there is, she said. Trying. Their son was born in December of 1884, on a cold, clear night with the stars out and Doc Briggs in attendance and Francis at Rosa's side and Abraham in the hall doing what men of that era were expected to do, which was pace and be anxious and be summoned when the work was done. He was summoned. He came through the door and saw Rosa, exhausted and radiant in the lamplight, and saw the child in her arms. And the expression on his face was one that Rosa would attempt to paint later and never quite capture to her satisfaction, because it was a thing of such uncomplicated, undefended love that it exceeded what paint could do. A boy, she told him. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the child with such attention, such careful, complete attention, that Rosa felt she was watching him memorize something. "Hello," Abraham said to his son. The baby opened dark eyes and looked at him with the uncomprehending intensity of the newborn, which is somehow not blank at all but full of something, and Abraham put out one finger and the baby's small hand closed around it. They named him Thomas, after Abraham's father, which was Abraham's idea, and which Rosa had not expected but had understood immediately. Not a sentimental gesture but a deliberate one, a reclamation, as if he were saying, this name gets to mean something different now. Thomas Bristol was from his first weeks an emphatic person, opinionated and loud and interested in everything, which his parents found challenging and deeply amusing in equal measure. He had Abraham's eyes and Rosa's chin, and a personality that appeared to belong entirely to himself, which they considered the correct outcome. Francis adored him with the wholehearted specificity of gray dance everywhere. Marisol brought him a carved wooden horse from a craftsman in Wichita, with a dark bay painted finish, which Rosa suspected was not accidental. Solomon, when introduced to Thomas in the barn at the appropriate age, regarded the boy with calm approval and allowed him to touch his nose, which the horse extended courteously. The year 1885 unfolded with the particular texture of a life well and fully lived. The cattle operation grew. The county approved funding for a second teaching position at the Caldwell Creek school, and Rosa was hired formally, which meant she was paid, which meant the thing she had been doing for love was now also recognized as real work, and she felt the recognition in the way you feel it when something true is named. She painted throughout that year with a deepening confidence, large, ambitious pieces that she felt were the best work she had ever done, informed by the landscape she now knew intimately and the life she now lived fully. A traveling merchant from Wichita saw 3 of her paintings in the Silver Spur one afternoon and asked if she would consider selling them. She sold 2 and kept 1, and the money went toward the cattle. Abraham framed the one she kept and hung it in the parlor, which was the first thing anyone saw when they came through their front door. That should go somewhere else, she said, not because she meant it but because it felt like the appropriate response to self-promotion. No, he said simply. She let it stay. In the spring of 1886, she began to feel the particular internal shift of a second pregnancy, which she recognized this time rather than discovering it, and which she announced to Abraham with considerably less ceremony than the first time, over breakfast, while Thomas was doing something inadvisable with a spoon. Again, she said. He looked up from his coffee. Already, he said. Already, she confirmed. He smiled, the full-face smile she had first seen in the livery by candlelight, and reached across the table and took her hand. Good, he said. You think so. "Thomas needs someone to argue with," he said. "He's starting to argue with Solomon, which the horse endures with great dignity but shouldn't have to." She laughed until Thomas looked at her with the serious concern of a 17-month-old who was not sure what was funny, but was willing to investigate. That pregnancy was different from the first, easier in some ways and more complicated in others, because she had a toddler to manage while also growing a person, and the logistics of this were considerable. Abraham rearranged his schedule at the Holt operation in ways that required some negotiation with Gerald Holt, who was, it turned out, entirely willing to accommodate a man whose wife was expecting because Gerald Holt had 6 children and understood perfectly well what the situation required. Frances moved into the spare room for the final 2 months of the pregnancy, ostensibly to help with Thomas, actually because she had decided this was where she was needed, and she was not wrong. The second child was born in October of 1886, a girl this time, smaller than Thomas had been and rather more peaceful, who arrived in the early afternoon on a day of warm autumn sun. They named her Clara, which was Rosa's choice, after the friend in Philadelphia who had written that letter, the letter that had hurt and also clarified, and who Rosa had resumed writing to. The friendship revived across the distance in the honest way of people who have decided that the distance is not an excuse. Clara Bristol arrived in the world with her father's eyes and her mother's expression of focused attention, and the first time Abraham held her, he looked up at Rosa with something that was so entirely itself that she could not find a word for it. It was not happiness exactly, or not only happiness, but the quality of a man who has arrived, deliberately, at a life he would not trade, and who knows it. Thomas, introduced to his sister, considered her carefully and then announced that she was small. "She will grow," Abraham told him. "Like me?" Thomas asked. "Just like you," Abraham confirmed. Thomas seemed satisfied. The years that followed were full ones. The cattle operation continued to grow with steady, unhurried purpose, until by 1889 Abraham was running a genuine small ranch on their own land, with 2 hired hands and a herd of 120 cattle, and a reputation in the county for honest dealing and well-managed stock that was worth more than any advertisement. He was respected in Caldwell Creek and in the surrounding ranching community, not for any single dramatic thing, but for the accumulated weight of consistently being a man of his word. Rosa taught at the school. She painted. She continued the painting class at the Silver Spur, which had by now produced 6 students who painted seriously and one, a rancher's daughter named June who had been there from the beginning, who sold her work through a gallery in Wichita. Rosa felt a proprietorial pride in this that was entirely generous and not competitive, the pride of the teacher who has watched someone grow into themselves. She wrote to Clara in Philadelphia regularly. She wrote to Frances when Frances retired from the bakery in 1888 and went to live with her daughter in St. Louis, which Rosa missed deeply, but accepted because Frances was 62 and had earned rest and her daughter needed her. She wrote letters that were frank and funny, and full of the particular textures of a life. Thomas losing a tooth and insisting on inspecting the gap in a mirror for 30 minutes. Clara learning to walk and approaching the task with such methodical determination that Abraham had said she would either be a scientist or a sergeant. Solomon developing a friendship with a barn cat that was entirely dignified on both sides. The first snowfall, the spring green, the summer heat that Abraham bore with his customary equanimity, while Rosa bore it with rather more complaint and no apology. She was not the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in 1882. But she was Rosa Talmadge, Rosa Bristol now, both names real, both names hers, and she knew who that was. She knew it the way you know a landscape when you have spent enough years walking it, not as information but as something in the body, something reliable and owned. One spring evening in 1889, with the children asleep upstairs and the house quiet and the plain showing through the parlor window in the blue-gold light of early evening, Rosa sat with her painting equipment at the kitchen table, working on a piece that had occupied her for 3 weeks. A large canvas showing the house and the barn and the land around them in the particular light of late afternoon. The light she loved most. The one that made every ordinary thing look significant. Abraham came in from the barn, pulled off his boots at the door, washed his hands at the basin, and came and stood behind her looking at the painting over her shoulder. "It's good," he said. "It's almost right," she said. "The light," he said. "Yes, the light is still not quite, but nearly." She set down her brush and looked at it. "It's the best thing I've done. Better than the one in the parlor, different from the parlor one. That was about the landscape." She looked at the canvas. "This one is about home." He sat down beside her and looked at the painting. "When I was a boy in Texas," he said, "I used to lie in the bunk and look at the ceiling and think about what a home would look like if I had one. And I couldn't picture it very clearly. I couldn't picture people in it." She looked at him. "And now," she said. He looked at the painting, at the house they had built together contained within it, the barn where Solomon and Compass lived, the garden she had made from ambition and very gradual competence. "And now I don't have to picture it," he said. She reached for his hand under the table, and he laced his fingers through hers, and the light came through the kitchen window and fell across the canvas and across the table and across both of them, warm and specific and very much itself. Thomas called from upstairs in the particular tone that indicated he had not actually woken but was calling in his sleep, which he did sometimes, and both his parents listened for a moment and then heard him settle back into quiet. "He dreamed about the calf again," Abraham said. "Probably," Rosa said. Thomas had developed an intense interest in a particular calf born that spring, which he had named George, and about which he had opinions that occupied him throughout most of his waking hours and apparently some of his sleeping ones. "He's going to be a rancher," Abraham said, with the satisfaction of a man who considered this a fine thing. "He's going to be whatever he decides to be," Rosa said. "Yes," Abraham agreed. "That too." She looked at him. In the evening light he looked, as he always did, exactly like himself, without performance or embellishment, the same man who had ridden along the fence line in the October morning of 1882, and asked if she knew whose fence she was sitting on. The same man who had walked with her in the winter grass and asked what kind of things she was thinking about. Who had gone back into the blizzard and pressed a summer flower and said, "I generally pay attention, and I do find myself looking forward to seeing you in a way I would describe as significant." "Abraham," she said. "Yes. I want you to know something." He waited with the patience that was so entirely characteristic of him, that deep, patient attention that had always made her feel genuinely listened to, not merely heard. "When I came here," she said, "I had lost quite a lot of myself, piece by piece, very gradually, and I came out here to get away from the place where I had lost it, which I thought was enough. I thought escape was recovery." She paused. "But it wasn't just escape that helped me. It wasn't just the distance or the painting or the teaching or the sky, though those things mattered enormously." She looked at him. "It was being seen. By you. It was being paid attention to by someone who wanted nothing adjusted or diminished, who just wanted to know who I actually was." He was very still. "You helped me remember myself," she said, "not by telling me who I was, just by paying attention to who I was consistently until I could see it too." He reached up and put his hand against the side of her face, the same way she had put her hand against his face years ago in the morning on the porch, when she had said, "We are going to be excellent at this," and he had said, "We are going to try very hard." "You were always yourself," he said. "I just showed up while you were in the process." "You did a great deal more than show up," she said. "Maybe a little more," he allowed. She leaned into his hand the way Solomon always leaned into her palm when she greeted him, a trust so natural and complete it required no deliberation. Outside, the plains darkened into evening. The first stars appeared, which in Kansas were always earlier and more numerous than seemed reasonable, as if the sky took its responsibilities seriously. The wind moved through the grass with the sound it made in all seasons, which was not quiet exactly but a kind of deep sustained note, the voice of a landscape that had been here long before them and would remain long after, patient and enormous and entirely indifferent, except that tonight it felt, as it often did, like it was somehow on their side. Clara called from upstairs, a clear awake call this time, which meant she was genuinely up and would need attending. They both moved at the same moment, which was how it had always been between them in the practical business of parenthood, not divided so much as simultaneous, both of them already turning toward the small, warm voice of their daughter. They were 5 years from the night Rosa had stood on a boardwalk in the October dust and told herself she was going to be fine. She had not known then, standing in that dust, what fine would look like when it arrived. She had not imagined this: the house, the children, the cattle moving in the south pasture at dusk, the painting class on Wednesday mornings, the school on Tuesday and Thursday, the letters to Clara and to Francis, the Saturday evenings when Abraham read to her and the Sunday mornings when they rode out on Solomon and Compass and let the Kansas plain show them what it had for them that week. She had not imagined Abraham Bristol, which was the main failure of her imagination. But here he was. Here they both were. She went upstairs to Clara, and he came behind her, and the house was warm and lit and full of the particular sounds of an evening that has no emergencies in it, only life moving through its ordinary cycles with the kind of completeness that is, Rosa had decided, the truest form of happiness, not a peak or an achievement but a continuity, a yes that keeps saying itself every day. She lifted Clara from the crib, and the baby, she was 2, and barely a baby anymore, but she was their baby settled against her shoulder with the boneless trust of a sleeping child, and Rosa stood in the warm upstairs room and breathed. Abraham stood in the doorway with his shoulder against the frame, watching her. "She's so like you," he said quietly, so as not to fully wake Clara. "She has your patience," Rosa said. "She has your certainty," he said. Clara made a small sound and pressed her face harder into Rosa's neck, which was one of the better feelings available in the world. "Go back to sleep," Rosa told her gently. She lowered her back into the crib and tucked the quilt, and stood looking down at her in the low light, the dark lashes on the round cheek, the small fist uncurling near the face, the absolute completeness of a child at peace. Abraham came and stood beside her, and they stood together over Clara's crib the way they had stood over Thomas's in the early years, the way parents stand over sleeping children everywhere and in every era, in the knowledge that this specific thing is irreplaceable. He put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him. Outside, the Kansas night was deep and full of stars, and the wind moved through the grass, and somewhere out in the pasture Solomon made a low sound in the dark, perfectly content. She thought for the last time and conclusively of the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in 1882 with a bruised heart and a fury she had mistaken for grief, who had sat on a fence rail with an unopened sketchbook and been told by a man on a dark horse that the fence belonged to Gerald Holt but that she was welcome to stay. She had stayed. She was glad. She was herself wholly, deliberately, without apology, and she was home. And in the morning there would be bread to bake and children to wake and cattle to move and paintings to finish and a class to teach and a life to keep building, carefully and with full attention, the way all the best things are built. She was Rosa Bristol. She had not forgotten herself. She had at last, with the right help and the right sky and the right man standing patient at the fence line, remembered.